Death is certain in any war, but what happens when killing earns you beers? A lot of what you know about the Vietnam War is worse than you imagined. The purpose of Agent Orange was designed to destroy the foliage where Viet Cong soldiers could hide and, as an added bonus, damage the fields used to feed them. But its usage was always morally questionable, arguably because it broke international law. You see, Agent Orange was an herbicide, and without getting too sciencey here, in order to kill that much brush in Vietnam, you have to be loaded with toxins. What no one really considered at the time was the long-term effects the dioxins had on people, some of which were reproductive issues, damage to the immune system, even cancer. Plus, the children of those exposed to Agent Orange were often born with physical and mental disabilities. Some were even born without eyes or parts of their brain and skull. To make things even worse, the United States has been reluctant to admit to a correlation between exposure to Agent Orange and birth defects for fear of having to make reparations. Don't just think of reparations to the Vietnamese either. Close to 2.5 million American soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange. It wasn't until 1991 when the Agent Orange Act was signed into law to treat soldiers' diseases caused by exposure. Your thought of a child soldier might be a modern image in your mind, but unfortunately, that's not the case at all. Kids as young as 13 were trained in the guerrilla warfare methods that the war was infamous for. Child soldiers were also given official awards and titles like the Valiant Destroyer of the Yanks. It was a lot easier to recruit children than you'd think. With the constant bombing of villages and families being uprooted, that made it easy for the Vietnamese Communist Party to paint American soldiers as the enemy and inundate young children with propaganda, instilling them with a sense of duty to serve their country. This childhood involvement included building roads and fortifications, as well as putting together supplies for soldiers. You've undoubtedly heard about the My Lai massacre, during which American soldiers killed up to 500 civilians in March 1968. U.S. military units received faulty intelligence that Viet Cong troops were in the My Lai region and that citizens had already evacuated. They were then given free rein to fire on anyone they found. Women, children, and elders were rounded up and killed, and buildings and farms were burned to the ground.
You know, this is going to be a free-for-all. You can shoot anything you want, anything that moves, as long as he's not one of your own.
Sadly, this wasn't a one-off either. In fact, the U.S. military was enacting Operation Speedy Express, a desperate attempt to pacify the entirety of the Mekong Delta. Nearly 11,000 Vietnamese people were reportedly killed over the course of the operation. Overall, north of 2 million Vietnamese civilians died during the war. During the Vietnam War, U.S. military officials decided to institute a policy that was widely referred to by soldiers as a body count, which is exactly what it sounds like. In practice, that ultimately meant that statistics were all that mattered. As Gary Nordstrom, a combat medic during the war, told The Nation in 2008, "For all enlisted people, that was the mentality. Get the body count, get the body count, get the body count." It was prevalent everywhere. Soldiers would do almost anything to get those numbers, including waiting for terrified civilians to run in fear or forcing them to walk in front of them in minefields. They even tried to hide those civilian casualties, claiming that they were actually armed militants and that their weapons had mysteriously been destroyed in the struggle. If you're wondering how American soldiers could just brazenly kill people with reckless abandon, well, they were motivated the old-fashioned way, with beer. Seriously. The battalions with the most kills were given beer or vacation days, mainly beer. The message sent to the public during the war was essentially that Vietnam was a vitally important piece of international politics. If it fell, it would allow the Soviet Union to expand its influence throughout Asia. In reality, though, that wasn't exactly the case. The Soviets had little interest in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam wasn't very strategic to really anything. But all of that information was kept secret from the public and covered up by blatant lies. That is until Daniel Ellsberg leaked everything to the public in 1971 by publishing the documents now known as the Pentagon Papers. The American people felt betrayed, and the fallout led to increased cynicism regarding the government. The country of Laos was in a rather complicated position during the Vietnam War. Earlier, during the Cold War, it was viewed as a vital piece of keeping communist forces at bay in Southeast Asia due to its proximity to China. As the Vietnam War approached, American interest grew due to the existence of communist supply routes through Laos and into Vietnam. Communist forces were indeed on the rise there, but in 1962, 14 nations, including the US, signed a treaty that recognized Laos as a neutral nation. But that didn't stop the US from interfering in Lao politics, which included the waging of a secret war. The CIA covertly trained and outfitted anti-communist forces in Laos to fight against the Viet Cong-aligned Pathet Lao. Less covertly, the U.S. military bombed supply lines on the Ho Chi Minh Trail starting in 1964. By the mid-1970s, over 2 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Laos, killing a full tenth of the population and leaving a quarter as refugees. To this day, no other nation has seen the same level of bombing as Laos did. What's crazy is that some of the bombs didn't detonate on impact, and they went on to kill over 20,000 people long after the war ended, people just randomly stumbling on unexploded bombs. In 1961, the CIA began a secret operation intended to sabotage North Vietnamese operations. Known as Operation 34A, the mission recruited and trained Vietnamese commandos and saboteurs to infiltrate North Vietnam. The mission lasted for about 3 years, at which point official documentation stated that there were 200 agents who had gone missing, many of whom were known to be alive and in prison. Then, in late 1965, military officials arbitrarily started to declare those agents as dead, until they were all assumed to have been killed in action, despite the knowledge that they were very much alive. The main reason they were left for dead was simply because it was cheaper. Those assumed dead couldn't be paid, and those funds could then be redirected to other operations. This action also allowed the US to wash their hands of the whole mission and pretend to move on. This whole secret operation was completely unknown to the public until the mid-1990s, at which point surviving agents, who had spent nearly 2 decades tortured in prison, faced an uphill legal battle for their back pay. In late 1972, President Richard Nixon tried to bring an end to the Vietnam War by making one of the most questionable decisions during his time in office, Operation Linebacker II, now known colloquially as the Christmas bombings. In short, American aircraft dropped 20,000 tons of bombs over a week and a half in late December, with a break on Christmas Day. 1,600 Vietnamese people were killed, as were 33 American airmen, all to accomplish Nixon's goal of forcing the North Vietnamese government back to the negotiating table for peace talks.
Cả những cái chuyện đấy tôi chứng kiến cả cái làng nó xơ xác, không có một cái cây nào có thể còn nguyên vẹn. Ở dưới sông thì cá chết.
The United States boasted that it accomplished Nixon's goal, but experts have since rebuffed that. The North Vietnamese government was running out of supplies and couldn't have sustained the war for much longer. Some experts even believe that North Vietnamese officials had already decided to come back to the table, but their message didn't reach the US before the bombings began. Thus, peace could have been had without all the extra bloodshed if Nixon had just waited. All that the bombings really accomplished was giving the North Vietnamese people a rallying point around their own heroism. Over the course of the war, some American soldiers started relationships with Vietnamese citizens, but the children born of these connections found themselves with long and hard roads ahead of them. On the cultural front, Vietnam favored neither premarital sexual relations nor relationships with foreigners. So these children were often abandoned shortly after their birth, left behind at orphanages by their mothers and completely unaware of their fathers' identities. The social stigma surrounding their identities led to significant cruelty. Other children teased them, adoptive families didn't want them, and many of them ended up uneducated and begging on the streets. Many of these kids hope to somehow make it to America and find their fathers, but a lack of documentation has made that nearly impossible for almost all of them, with reportedly only 3% locating their birth fathers.
We're gonna start building this relationship that we don't have for 40 years, so love you, Dad. I love you.
In the decades since the Vietnam War ended, thousands of American veterans have managed to find peace by returning to Vietnam. Some have even moved there permanently, building new lives for themselves and feeling more respected there than they ever did in the US. Despite being trained to hate the Vietnamese, they found peace, love, and redemption in a country that long symbolized war for them. And those positive associations aren't necessarily a new discovery. In fact, some soldiers recognized it during the war. Some photos taken during the conflict showcase American GIs rescuing Vietnamese children from war zones, or even tending to injured Viet Cong soldiers. None of this is bad, of course, but it paints the entire conflict in a far worse light. American veterans have questioned why they were ever fighting there in the first place, and what the American government found so threatening. While trying to find those answers, many of them have found the war to be more and more pointless. As one veteran told the BBC in 2016, "If I were Vietnamese, I would have fought with the Viet Cong.